Hello everyone and welcome back to another video of my point of view as an advantage blackjack player. Today we will be continuing with some sessions in Vegas, showing what it's like to play high stakes advantage blackjack in the sweatiest city in the country. In my last video I visited Resorts World, The Wynn, Encore, Mohegan, and Fontainebleau. I only got to sit down and play at 2 of those spots, and it gave a really good look at just how competitive Vegas casinos are with card counters. They do not want us playing their games, and they pay very close attention to anyone who sits down at a blackjack table. While the quick backoffs can be frustrating, as advantage players we beat Vegas 10 minutes at a time. It's a game of cat and mouse, and once in a while the casino surveillance isn't quick enough. In this video I had a couple sessions that lasted longer than expected, as well as some instant backoffs. All in all, it was fairly typical Vegas stuff, and I'm excited to show you guys what it was like today. As always, I'm using the high-low count system to determine my true counts, and I'm playing a bet spread that will max out at either one hand of 2,000 if I'm playing solo, or 2 hands of 1,200 if I'm playing with other people. If you guys want to learn how the high-low system works, and how it can be used to play blackjack with an advantage, check out my How to Count Cards video. It has everything you need to know. Of course, I'm also playing perfect basic strategy and using many count-based deviations when the odds are in my favor. So after I finished up Fontainebleau in my last video, I took a break for some food and then hit up a spot called Ellis Island. This is a small casino just a couple blocks off the strip, and in past trips they have had a pretty decent double deck game. Upon walking in, I was quite displeased to see that they had gotten rid of the double deck game and replaced it with a 6-deck game that had 2 decks cut off. This is pretty garbage deck penetration. It was still beatable though, so I sat down and started to play. I didn't make it long because these guys must have remembered me from last time. I didn't even raise my bet from table minimum before getting approached by the pit boss.
Alright man, we're not gonna take your action. Okay.
So yeah, Ellis Island was a no-go. In my time playing the minimum bets, I lost $90. I wasn't too sad about losing this game, it wasn't worth much, and it was time to go try out some high quality games. Next on my list was the Palms. Here they have a double deck game where dealer stands on soft 17, double after split is allowed, and you may double on any first 2 cards. There is no resplit aces or surrender. The dealer cuts off just over half a deck from play, which is a deck penetration of roughly 70% and is very acceptable. The table minimum here is $100, which is the same amount as my bet at True 1. I'm not going to show the bets of $100 as it's too much of a hassle figuring out if it was a True 1 bet or a negative count bet, so I'm just going to show counts of True 2 or higher. The profit counter in the top right won't be perfectly accurate because of this, but it should be pretty close. Anyways, I found the table I wanted and I sat down and started playing. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy this POV content, it really helps me out. I had the table all to myself and I played a few hands into the first shoe before the count raised to a True 2, borderlining on True 3. I settled on a bet between the 2 and threw out a bet of $300. I was dealt a 17 versus dealer's 4. I stood and the dealer also drew to 17, so this first hand was a push. The count had now dropped down to a definite True 2 and I lowered my bet to $200. I was dealt a 13 versus dealer's 9. I had to hit it and I turned it into a good old 23, so this one was no good. After this, my bets were down to $100 for the rest of the shoe, so let's fast forward a bit. I played a couple hands into the next shoe and then the count went up to a True 2. I put out my bet of $200 and was dealt a 9 versus dealer's 10, and through some amazing wizardry I turned my hand into a 20, dealer drew to 23, so this hand was paid out. The count was now up to a True 6, which called for a massive jump in my bet. True 6 on my solo spread was one hand of $1,500, and I only had $800 in chips in front of me. This means I had to buy in for another $700 to fund this hand. Like I said in my last video, I hate it when I have to do this because it's such an odd thing to do. Like, who else other than a card counter is going to buy in for more when they already have $800 in front of them and then bet it all? F it though, I gotta follow the bet spread because I'm here to generate as much EV as my bankroll can handle. I got my extra chips and put out my hand of $1,500. I was dealt a 20 versus dealer's 10, dealer flipped a 2 and then a 10 for a total of 22, so we won this massive $1,500 hand. The count was now down to a True 4, so my bet lowered drastically to one hand of $600. I was dealt a 16 versus 10, and since the count was positive, I deviated from basic strategy and I stood. It was no use though, as the dealer drew to 19, so this one was a loss. The count dropped further down to a true 3, so I lowered my bet to $400. I was dealt a 15 versus 10, I had to hit and luckily didn't bust, turning it into 19 instead. Dealer drew to 18, so this hand was paid out. Count was now bordering on true 4, but not quite there, so I raised my bet to $500. I was dealt a 20 versus dealer's 10. Of course I stood and the dealer ended up drawing to 26, so this hand was also paid. Back to a true 3 and a $400 bet, I was dealt a soft 18 versus 10. This hand always hits versus the dealer's 10, which I did and turned it into a hard 18. Dealer flipped a 7 for 17, so we won our third hand in a row. After this, the count dropped down to a true 1 or lower, and ironically now is when I get the blackjack. I'll take it though, and the count stayed negative for the rest of the shoe, so I was back down to minimum bets. After this, I played an entire 3 shoes in negative counts, so nothing worth showing. Finally, on the 4th shoe, the count started to rise again and we hit a true 2. Out went my $200 and I was dealt a soft 13 versus 3. I turned it into a soft 18 and stood. Dealer ended up busting, so this one worked out. All those low cards were great for me, as the count had now jumped up to a true 5. This means it was time for a hand of $1,200. I threw it out there and was dealt a 20 versus dealer's 9. Naturally, I stood and the dealer drew to 17, which I was okay with. Count had now dropped down to a true 4, so I lowered my bet to $600. I was dealt a 13 versus dealer's 10. Once again, I had to hit, and the same result as my last 13, the old reliable 23. Luckily, we were back to true 5, so I had a chance to make it back and more. I raised my bet to $1,200, and what do you know, I was dealt another 13. However, this time I didn't even get a chance to turn it into a 23 because the dealer had blackjack, so I just automatically lost. The count dropped down to a true 4, so I lowered my bet to $600 and was dealt a 20 versus dealer's 4. I stood and the dealer drew to 17, so this one worked out. Next, I was dealt the exact same hand, this time against the dealer's 10. Once again I stood and the dealer drew to 17 again, meaning this hand was also paid out. The count had now dropped down to a true 2 and I was dealt a 12 versus ace. I didn't buy insurance and I drew a 5 for 17. Dealer ended up drawing to 20, so this hand was a loss. That was the last hand of the shoe, so we shuffled and started a new one. Shortly into the next shoe, we hit a true 2, borderlining on a true 3, so I settled between the two again and put out a bet of $300. I was dealt a blackjack, dealer was showing ace, and I did not take even money. Dealer did end up having it though, so this hand was a push. After this, the count went negative, so I was back to minimum bets. Sadly, I wouldn't get another chance to raise them because my time here was up.
Hello. How's it going? I'm a casino manager.
Hi. Okay.
So yep, another back off, which is always expected to happen eventually here in Vegas, and basically anywhere for that matter when you play like I do. My session here was 28 minutes long, my hourly EV was $1,150, and I profited $2,175. All in all, it was a pretty decent session. I quickly moved on to my next target, which was a casino called Orleans. They also have a pretty decent double deck game. Dealer hits on soft 17, double after split is allowed, and you may double any first 2 cards. There's no resplit aces or surrender, and the dealer cuts off just under a deck from play, which is a deck penetration of roughly 55%. This isn't the worst I've ever seen, but it certainly could be better. For this table, I played a $25 minimum bet. So once I got there and found my table, I started playing right away. I played a few minimum bets until the count reached a true 1, so I put out a bet of $100. I was dealt a soft 14 versus dealer's 8. I hit and got a 7 for 21. Dealer drew to 18, so this first hand won. On the next hand, I was dealt a soft 17 versus dealer's 2. Normally this is just a hit, but at a true 1 or higher it's a double, so I did just that. Dealer drew to 19, so I was hoping for a 3 or 4, but sadly I had an 8 for a total of 15 and I lost this hand. The count was now a borderline true 2, so I raised my bet to $150. I was dealt a 17 versus dealer's 4, which I stood on, and the dealer drew to 18, meaning this hand also lost. The count was now up to a true 2, borderline true 3, so I put out my bet of $300, and I was dealt a 16 versus dealer's 5. I stood, and luckily the dealer drew to 26, so this hand was paid out. We were now up to a true 4, so I raised my bet to $600 and was dealt a 15 versus dealer's 8. I had to hit, and unfortunately I busted on this one. I was pulling out some real cash now because the count had raised to a true 6, and that means one hand of $1,500. This situation feels a bit more natural to me because I had just lost all the chips in front of me, so when I raise my bet drastically after losing it all, it kinda makes it look more like gambler behavior. I put out my bet of $1,500 and was dealt a 17 versus dealer's 9. I had to stand and was preparing for a loss, but amazingly the dealer drew to 25 and I was paid out on this massive hand. Count was now true 7 and it was time for my max bet of $2,000. I put it out there and was dealt a 9 versus dealer's 10. I didn't even get a chance to hit because the dealer had blackjack and my $2,000 bet left the chat. The count was still true 7, so I had a chance to make it back, hopefully. I bought in and put out another bet of $2,000. I was dealt a 9 versus dealer's 8. I hit and got a 10. This 19 was gonna have to do, and luckily the dealer flipped a 10 for 18, meaning this hand was a win. That was the last hand of the shoe, and what a roller coaster that was. Dealer shuffled and we got into a new one. At this point I was joined by another player at the table, so I switched to my 2-hand spread. I played some negatives for a few hands until the count reached a true 2. I put out my 2 hands of 200 and on the first hand I was dealt a 19 versus dealer's 2, which I stood on. My second hand was a pair of aces, so I split them up and hoped for some good cards. As you guys can see, in these pitched double deck games they deal cards face down a lot, which can make counting them difficult. You gotta be extra focused on games like this. Dealer drew to 18 and I was quite pleased to have both my ace split hands turn out to be 21, meaning all 3 of my hands won. After this, the count went negative for a while, so let's fast forward to a couple shoes later when the count hit a true 4. I put out my 2 hands of 500 and on my first hand I was dealt a 15 versus dealer's 8. I had to hit and sadly busted on this one. My second hand was a 13, which I turned into 20, so that was nice. The dealer drew to 19, so my second hand was paid out. The count had now raised to a true 5, so I raised my bet to 2 hands of 800. On my first hand I was dealt an 11 versus dealer's 10. This was a great double opportunity, so I put out another $800 and hoped for a good card. My second hand was a 7, which I hit into a 19 and stood on. The dealer flipped a 10 for 20, so I for sure lost the one hand, and now I was really hoping for a 10 on that double, and sure enough there it was, so the double was paid out. We were now up to a true 6, so I raised my bet to 2 hands of 1,000. My first hand was a soft 14 versus dealer's 10. I had to hit on it and unfortunately turned it into a 24, so that was a bust. My second hand was a 13, and you guys already know what's coming, the old reliable 23, so sadly I lost both hands here. That was the last hand of the shoe, and I was sure that the surveillance attention was on me now. I was hoping to get a few more high counts in before they could back me off. I played through a couple negative shoes with the other player, and by the time the count started to get positive, he had left, so I was back to playing solo. Here the count had raised to true 3, so I put out a bet of $400. I was dealt a 12 versus dealer's 9. I hit and got a 5 for 17. Dealer drew to 24, so this hand was paid. The count had now jumped up to a true 5, so out went the bet of $1,200. I was dealt a 14 versus dealer's 5, which I stood on and crossed my fingers for the dealer bust. Sadly, dealer drew to 19, so this one was no good. The only positive to come out of that situation was that the count was now up to a true 7, so it was time to potentially have a big win. I put out my $2,000 bet and was dealt a 7 versus dealer's 10. Ouch. I hit and got a 10 for 17 and prepared for another loss, but amazingly the dealer drew to 26, so this massive $2,000 hand was actually paid out. That was the last hand of the shoe and a great way to end it. Dealer shuffled and we got into a new one. I played a few hands in the negative before the count hit a true 1. I put out my bet of $100 and was dealt a 17 versus dealer's 2. Of course I stood on this one and the dealer drew to 20, so this was a loss. The count was now up to a true 2, so I raised my bet to 1 hand of 200. I was dealt a 20 versus dealer 7 and the dealer flipped a 10 for 17, so this hand was paid out. We were now back into a negative count, so I lowered my bet to table minimum. This was the end of the line for me though, because I had officially overstayed my welcome.
Sorry, but we can't play blackjack.
Once again, as expected, we got the back off, this time a little later than usual, which is always nice. One of my friends who had just walked in to tag me out watched the whole thing unfold, so that was pretty funny too. All in all, I got a 46-minute session here, my hourly EV was $820, and my session profit was $1,040. A 46-minute session is great for Vegas, and I got to leave with a profit, so overall it was a good session. I'm going to end it here. This was the last spot I hit on my first day in Vegas, so I was exhausted. It was nice to go back to the hotel with a couple wins though, because it could have gone either way on this first day. Don't forget to check out Blackjack Advisors if you're interested in fast-tracking your advantage blackjack training and networking with other players. They offer live stream sessions for all skill levels, Q&As, member chat, giveaways, and more. It's a very valuable resource for card counters of any skill level. And that's all I got for you guys today. As always, thank you so much for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe for more POV videos like this. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.